Does God exist? How do you know? And how do you talk to skeptics about it? Do you have to be a scholar or a philosopher to do apologetics? What are apologetics? We're going to talk about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone, Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC, and I'm actually your host for today's talk. I'm swapping roles with Evan, who normally pushes all the buttons and hosts the show, so I'm trying that on for size, but I am joined by Ted Wright. He's kind of a modern-day Indiana Jones. He's the founder and director of Epic Archaeology, which is an apologetic ministry dedicated to showing the archaeological and historical trustworthiness of the Bible. He's also appeared in documentaries on the History Channel and CNN, so he's very fancy. And we've got Taylor Neill also joining us. I call him a rising apologist. He is a sayer of truth, enemy of unreason, and ruler of the multiverse. Y'all, he wrote this bio. He can sneeze with his eyes open. Mostly harmless. Yes, but in all seriousness...
Should have read my bio first.
Yeah, for real. But then it would have been such a letdown for his. But he came to faith through apologetics while in college and now is in his master's program for philosophical apologetics at HBU and teaches at his church. And again, I'm Sarah Stone. I work with what I call fringies, which are people on kind of the edge of faith who have questions about faith or maybe altogether think the whole Team Jesus thing is very stupid. And I love engaging them and just talking about all of that. So, and I'm over at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church. And you are listening to KPFT, which is, of course, a listener-supported community radio. And now more than ever, we really need you to help this continue. So we run on donations from people in our community. So you can go to kpft.org to learn more about giving and, of course, mention Theology on Air. You can also call in today. If you're listening live, the number is 713-529-8737, or you can chime in on Facebook Live. You can find us on the Theology on Tap Facebook page and put your question in there, and we'll try to tackle it. Before we get going with our topic for today, I want to say, of course, Houston and cities all across the world are in quarantine zone because of the coronavirus. And I know that's hot on everybody's minds. And so especially as we continue this weird social distancing, if that's really hitting you hard, if this is scary to you, if you have questions about how God can be loving and powerful and that something like this can happen, reach out to us. Find us on Facebook Live. Find us with the information we give at the end. And or I'll even give my number and you can text me and we can talk more about all of that. If you need toilet paper, reach out. We will get you some. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started with our conversation for today. Before we kind of get into the meat of what we're doing, I would just love to hear each of you give a quick blurb about what is this word apologetics and how has that interfaced with your own life? Like how have you interacted with apologetics? You want to start us, Taylor?
Sure. So apologetics comes from the Greek root apologia, which literally means to make a defense. We also, as Christians, have a biblical mandate for this. 1 Peter 3:15 is the one that comes to mind for me the most often. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that you have, yet do this with gentleness and respect. For me, apologetics has been so important because it's the way I came back to faith. In college, there was a time where I wasn't a believer, and I was in search of meaning and truth, and I was in a pretty ragged state when I discovered the study of apologetics. So it played obviously a really important role in my life, and it's become an obsession of mine. I've stuck with it. It's going on 13, 14 years now.
Well, your obsession is our gain because we love having you on the show. What about you, Ted?
That's great. Yeah, same thing. I actually was saved when I was 9 years old, back many years ago when I was at Vacation Bible School. Some folks remember, who grew up in the church, remember VBS. I don't know if they still have it anymore, but I was saved at 9, and then when I went to college, I was getting my degree in archaeology, and a couple of my professors began to question the stories that I'd heard growing up in the Bible, and I didn't really know how to answer. I knew that I believed these stories, but I didn't know how they connected to reality. And so that set me on a quest to try to find evidence, if there is in fact any evidence, the stories in the Bible are actually true, like the story of Noah and the ark, or the story of the Exodus, or the story of whatever. So I was going to a secular college, and I ended up going to the library of the school, of the university. Mississippi State University is where I went. And actually in the library there was a book by Josh McDowell. And in that book, Josh McDowell, I found some resources that talked about the archaeological and philosophical evidence for God's existence. So that opened my mind up to a completely new, different world of actually how to defend the faith, and that there actually are reasons that you can actually defend the faith. So
It doesn't have to be a blind leap.
no, it's absolutely. In fact, I was about to close with this quote here. Of course, if you're an archaeologist, Indiana Jones is a big. And one of in the Last Crusade, Indy he's trying to find the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
And he steps out into this
The cavern, the ravine. Yeah.
It's the leap of faith, and so I think the question we're going to be talking about today is this: and is Christianity a leap of faith in the dark, or is it a leap of faith in the light? Is there evidence for Christianity? So.
Ooh, I like that.
I just, when you were talking, I just want to make an editorial comment because
Feel free.
I think it's so interesting that we both grew up in churches, and yet both of us got to college without realizing that reason, evidence, and philosophy could be marshaled so powerfully in support of theism generally and Christianity in particular.
Well, I think that's so many people's story, which is why we're doing this podcast today, because some people don't land where you guys did, and they are now in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and on, still questioning all this kind of stuff. And so that's kind of what we're going to do today is when you think about, I know a lot of people listening are just regular folks, right? You're not a theological scholar, you're not a philosopher, and yet if you believe that Jesus is real and that Christianity makes sense, and you want to be able to talk to your friends about that, or talk to skeptics, but you think, well, gosh, I don't know how to do that because I don't have the degree or whatever. Today's show is really just going to give you some very simple ideas to kind of put in your back pocket, to have at the ready, to talk to people. And I'm going to have Ted kind of tee us off with, there's 4 questions. He claims that if we can not memorize, but kind of know these ideas, these 4 questions, that we can talk to anybody about faith. And it's very easy, accessible, conversational. So Ted, why don't you give us kind of the quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. And just so folks will know, these 4 questions are actually based partially on a book.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to try this again.
Having some technical difficulties. Would you like to hear a joke?
All right.
Here's the joke to fill the time while they
Test,
fix
1, 2.
mics.
All right, we're good.
Why can't you trust an atom?
There we
Now,
go.
you're not here to answer, so I'm just going to tell you the answer.
Are we good now?
You can't trust an atom because they make up everything. Oh, it's a science joke. Okay, are we
I
good?
think so. That might
We've
be
got-
real quiet. So
Okay.
Okay, we've got our technical advisor helping us out here. So
Okay.
everybody talk nice and close to the mic. Don't be
All right.
shy. Ted, take us away.
Yes. So these 4 questions are based on the book by Frank Turek and Norm Geisler called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," and
Funny.
there are 12 points in this. And so years ago, when I actually worked for Cross Examine with Frank, we boiled the 12 points down into 4 basic questions. And you don't have to know a lot if you're a Christian out there and you want to try to defend your faith. You don't have to remember all this stuff. They're just 4 basic questions that if you know how to answer these questions in the affirmative and you know how to answer them reasonably, you can make a good case that Christianity is true.
Yeah.
And so here are the questions. Number 1, does truth exist? Is there such a thing as truth? Number 2, does God exist? And by God we mean a supernatural being who created the world.
Yeah.
And we can flesh that out later.
Sure.
And number 3 is, are miracles possible? Which we'll talk about later too. And then number 4 is the New Testament historically reliable? So does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament historically reliable? If you can answer all 4 of those questions, then we believe that you can make a very good case that Christianity is true and can be believed.
Yeah, and just so you know, as you're listening, this podcast, we are going to cover the first 2 of those and maybe even get into the weeds a little bit about how someone might react. And then we're going to do a follow-up podcast with the second 2. So we're going to leave you at a cliffhanger. You're going to be jonesing for that next podcast. You can't wait till it comes out. Indiana Jonesing! Oh my gosh. I have to give credit to Evan, our producer off to the side that made that joke. I don't want to take credit for someone else's joke. That was good. Okay, well, start us off with question number 1. What's the question, and then what's the answer, and unpack it a little bit.
Okay. Does truth exist? So one of the things that people often say today is that, well, you have your truth, I have my truth. You know, people have different beliefs.
That is so true.
Different religions. And so the question is, it may seem like for folks who don't really deal with this, it may seem like just kind of a crazy question to even talk about. Why would you even ask a question? Does truth exist?
Yeah.
But it's a foundational question because how we define truth then affects other questions down the road, because if truth is relative, if there is no such thing as absolute truth, then not even atheism can be true. Nothing can be true if there is no such thing as something that is connected to reality. So how we define truth then becomes of very great importance.
Yeah.
Whether you're an apologist, or whether you're studying Christianity, or whether you're studying epidemiology, you're trying to find a source for where a virus came from. It's not a matter of opinion. It's
Yeah.
a matter of what is the evidence and where. And so, for whatever reason, when we come to religious questions, well, about Christianity, well, it's a little different. It's all a matter of perspective. Well, no, if the laws of logic apply to reality and all questions about reality, then they apply to religious questions as well. And one of the questions that we'll be exploring in these two podcasts is, who was Jesus and did he rise again from the dead? That is a question of fact. Did it actually happen?
Right.
So does truth exist? And I would say this. So here's how, and I'm going to give it to Taylor here in a second. So I would say this. Here's how I would define truth. Truth is something that is true for all people at all times and in all places. So no matter where you come from, whether you're in China, whether you're in India, whether you're in Africa, America, Texas, Connecticut, wherever you are, truth is true for all people, all times, and all places. And truth is that which corresponds to reality, not to what I feel or what I think, but actually what corresponds to reality. And one of the great tools that we use to discover what the truth is something called the law of non-contradiction. And this is not something that people just made up out of thin air. This is actually a law that the Greek philosopher Aristotle, he didn't even invent it either. Like math wasn't invented, it was discovered. He discovered these laws of logic. And it's basically this, that two opposite things cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. And I'll give you one quick example. So I know this is this crazy idea. There is to me, I cannot comprehend this, but there are people today who actually believe the earth is flat.
Oh, this is so hurtful because I actually do believe that.
Do you believe that? Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. No.
No, so if someone, let's just take the two statements. The earth
Yeah.
is flat, the earth is round. Okay, those two statements cannot, based on the law of non-contradiction, they cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. And what's the determiner of that? Reality is the determiner of that.
Yeah.
And so truth is that which and the law of non-contradiction helps us to discover that. So one other little quick thing here: 2 + 2 = 4 is either true or false. It's not a matter of opinion. So the same thing: either God exists or He doesn't exist. That's another question you could apply to that. So truth is a very important concept to talk about when we're talking about Christianity. So that's why we need to go in and lay the foundation first to talk about truth. And I know that's been your experience, and Sarah, your experience as well, where you talk to people, and a lot of my friends as well will think that truth is just your perspective. But I wonder if you two have had interactions with people like that.
Yeah, I have. And what's interesting about it is, and I made the comment the last time I was on the show, but we didn't get a chance to get into it. I believe everybody believes in truth, whether they realize it or not, because it's one of those things that to deny truth exists is to actually claim that truth exists. Because you're saying that this claim that
so
I'm
meta.
making right now is true. This represents an objective feature of reality, right? So Frank does a really good job of breaking this down. When somebody says to him, there is no truth, he just asks him the question, is that true?
Yeah.
Because, see, that claim itself asserts to be true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There are a few of those, aren't there?
Yeah,
Like a few examples you can give us.
Yeah, there
Train us.
there is no truth. You can't know the truth. All truth is relative. It's true for you, but not for me. If you apply that claim to itself, then it doesn't make sense. Like, is that true? If they say there's no truth, then you could ask the question, well, is that true? Well, you can't know the truth. Is that true?
Yeah.
Because if it's true, it's false. So it's a
If
self-referential.
it's true, it's false.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a mind screw sometimes.
It is. It
But-
is. Well, it's like saying, I cannot speak a word of English. You just did.
Yeah.
So it's either you get it or you don't. It's like a joke, kind of sort of like you either get the joke or you don't. And if you have to explain it, then You kind of
Right,
miss it.
yeah.
But
Right.
but it's not. So it's. I
But
don't
it's
think
funny because it appeals to something we all intuitively realize,
Right.
right?
I think Sarah. I don't know if you were going to get to this, Sarah. But one of the things that people, when you're talking to people, sometimes it doesn't land when you talk about like the law of non-contradiction and logic and things. Some people are, they don't operate in that realm. They have different jobs and they come from different backgrounds. So one of the problems or one of the challenges I think for someone who does believe that truth is corresponds to reality is how do you explain this in just a basic, easy to understand format?
Well, I think it's some about making it easy and accessible, and some about actually forcing someone to think for the first time about how they think about truth. So, you can say, like, the sentence to me that is the sort of most stripped down is either God exists or he doesn't, or she, or whatever. Like, we are thinking it really broad strokes at this point, but either there is a God or there isn't a God. One of those things is true, and one of those things they can't both be true. But then you find what happens is the conversation pivots off to the side somewhere when I talk to skeptics, and they'll say things like, well, maybe so, but when you get into all this religion and faith stuff, it's also like kind of ethereal and nebulous that maybe each religion has a little bit of truth, or then there's this my truth, your truth business, which really isn't about truth, it's about perspective or experience. They'll say, well, what's true for me is that there isn't a God. And so you have to somehow lovingly, kindly point out how absurd that is without, saying, well, that's dumb. There either is or isn't a God, whether you like it or not, and then we can talk about what kind of God. But I'm curious when people come back at you and say, well, that might be true for you, but not for me. Kind of, what do you do with that? I mean,
I'm less sensitive than some people on this. In a kind way, not in a rude way, but I would just turn the question back to them. Is that proposition true for you but not for me? So if I assert that truth is absolute, is that true for me? Is that absolutely true for me? And so I think that exposes the problem in most cases, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's just a process of working that out in the conversation, I guess.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. You at some point you can't dance around the issue of truth because you don't want to go to the next step if they think that truth is relative and you go to God, does God exist? And they're still going to be in this whole thing of truth is relative. So I taught apologetics before in seminary, and so when I taught it, I would use the 12 points in the book I mentioned earlier from Geisler and Turek. And in that book, it begins with, does truth exist? And it ends with, Jesus rose from the dead. But all in between, there are all these questions. In addition to these 4 questions, these other questions. And what I tell my students is that everybody you meet that you have a conversation with, they are somewhere on that spectrum. They're either denying truth or they're denying God's existence or they're denying miracles. And you as a Christian, as someone who wants to try to help them to come to Christ, you have to figure out where they are.
Yeah,
but you don't want to go. And what happens is Christians, they will begin arguing at point 14 or whatever, point 10,
Yeah.
and they haven't. But then they're so frustrated because they're like, well, they don't. But you haven't done the work yet in point 1.
Yeah.
They still believe truth is relative. You're just shooting yourself in the foot.
It's true, and
True. Go ahead.
I've been guilty of this myself. And there's another book that I think has really helped me out in this area, and that's the book by Kokel. Help me out. Tactics by
Very
Greg
excellent
Kokel.
book.
So important to ask questions because how do you find out where they are on that spectrum without
I was
asking
hoping
them a
someone would bring
question?
this
How
up.
did you come to that conclusion?
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And then one of the other things that you can do in a situation like that is just adopt the person's premise and see if it works out, see if it makes sense, right?
Meaning what? Take what they're saying and work it to its logical conclusion?
Yeah, it's called a reductio ad absurdum. So I know,
if I had
sorry.
a nickel.
But you take the claim to its logical conclusion,
Yeah.
right? And so if somebody says, well, that's true for you, but not for me, and I come back, well, is that true for you, not for me? And if that's still not getting it, then I'm like, okay, well, if that's true,
Yeah.
why should I believe it? Because it's not true for me.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now anything that they say to me going forward, I don't have any good reason to believe that because it's not true for me. It's only true for you.
What do you do when you have these conversations with someone and they come back and say, well, okay, fine. I can assent to there is only one truth, but how do we know? How do we know it's true?
Yeah, so I know where I go with this. It depends on who you're talking to. That's
sure.
That's the answer. And again, it's always going to be best to ask a question, make sure, what do you mean by that? Really flesh out that objection and what is the person saying. But if you ask me how I know things, I mean, I access the external world through my senses, right?
Oh, it's crazy because I do that too.
I know. Well, everybody
Yeah.
does.
Most people do.
Oh my gosh.
But then there's the question of, like, are our senses reliable,
Trustworthy.
and trustworthy, and things like that,
Right.
which is also, I think, a really important and interesting and fruitful question. But if that's not really what they had in mind when they brought the objection up, then that derails a conversation pretty quickly.
Well, but it comes up a lot because people will say, well, that's true for you, not for me. Then you get them sort of past that hurdle and they'll say, okay, but how can we know it's true? You claim, and somehow then it always goes to like evolution and creation. We are not going there today. But, and they'll say, well, some scientists say this and some scientists say that. How do you know who to believe? Or you Christians all think XYZ, fill in something crazy, And that's where I find myself getting tripped up. But I mean, we're going to get to more of that in the next question. I will say one more thing about the Greg Kuchel idea of asking these questions when someone makes a statement about something about Christianity they don't like or something skeptical, right? The idea is before you launch into your major apologetic rant that you have about it, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you ask them these simple questions like, well, why do you think that? How did you come to that conclusion? And I actually tried this out the other day. And it was fantastic. I was talking to someone and in a group of friends that all knew about me, but this person didn't know me very well. And I said something like, so where are you on the whole, faith, churchy, team Jesus kind of, spectrum? What's your story? And he said a little bit about growing up Methodist, but he's not really into it now. And how could you be? Because the Bible is really just a giant game of telephone with men passing it back and forth, and we can't really trust it. And one of my friends said, oh, no, what have you done? Sarah's going to, but I tried it on for size. Instead of saying, we have all kinds of evidence for the reliability of Scripture, I said, interesting. Well, how did you come to that conclusion? Like, what makes you think that? And he took a long pause, which I won't do on radio because they say not to do that. And then he said, well, I guess I just made it up. And I realized I just saved so much breath and energy not having to give him the lecture because he was really honest, which I was thankful for. But he just hadn't really thought about it, and he just made that idea up, and then we could just go from there,
Yeah.
But what's so interesting about that is even if that person doesn't take a giant leap, like the person in your example, most of them will take a step if they come to the conclusion themselves, rather than me telling them and trying to persuade.
Same
them
is
that
true in
way.
therapy.
Yeah.
I used to be a therapist. Same idea is lead people to come to the conclusion themselves. They have most of the time they know the right answer.
And the other thing that I find out sometimes is kind of sometimes disappointing to me. I'll ask 3 questions and I'll find out this was not actually an opportunity to use apologetics. A more pastoral approach is needed here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, darn it.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can shift gears. Let's do that
Sure.
too. But when you realize that this person's objections aren't intellectual.
Yeah.
Can I add one
Yeah.
one thing, if it's okay, Sarah?
Yeah.
Going back to this idea about truth being absolute and truth corresponding to reality. As as everybody knows, I mean, we live in a very pluralistic society,
Yeah.
more so today, I think, than we've ever lived in, and people are offended if you come across as saying that you believe this is true for everybody.
Yeah.
This is a sensitive issue. It's like to say that we think Jesus is the only way is an arrogant thing.
Yeah.
But what I want to
Exclusive.
say, a couple of things, and then we can move on, is to go back to this. Contrary beliefs are possible. People can believe contradictory things,
Yeah.
but they can't all be true at the same time. It's not a problem of Christianity. This is the laws of logic. You have a problem with Christianity. You have a problem with reason. This is not a Christian thing. This is just and that's not to be mean. That's not meant to be mean, but it does bring up a point, and that is truth is offensive. If you say that truth, you can't get around the fact that it's going to offend somebody. You don't have to be offensive because, as you quoted 1 Peter 3:15, do this with gentleness and respect.
Yeah.
But we speak the truth in love. But there are people, and I know I have friends, and I've done it as well. You can be as loving, as kind as you possibly can to people to try to share the truth with them. But the truth itself will be offensive. Jesus even said, "Don't be surprised if the world hates you. Do not be surprised because it hated me first. I mean, 2,000 years ago when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man comes to the Father. I mean, that is an arrogant thing to say.
Yeah.
If it's really not true, I mean, that is an arrogant thing to say. So either he's telling the truth, either he really is the way, the truth, and the life, or he is an imposter and a psycho and a crazy man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And he also says that if you're hated for my name, then you're blessed.
exactly.
So I think it's an acceptable risk to take to offend people, and if we really love them, then we will risk being offensive.
Yeah.
And just one final thing I wanted to say about that is it does tie nicely back to that first, kind of sub point that you made about the law of non-contradiction. The person that says it's arrogant to think that only your way of looking at the world is correct, they have a way of looking at the world that they think is correct.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're
That's
telling
true.
me that my way is wrong
Right.
and their way is right, and yet that is the very thing
Yeah.
that they purport to be offended by.
Listen, if I'm going to tell my girlfriends that they have kale on their teeth after they've eaten it, they can
And
believe
she
it or
will.
not believe it, and I will tell you that. And you need to tell me that too. We need to tell each other true things, even if it's hard to hear. You can do it about the gospel too, I promise. Let's move on to the second question. And Taylor, I'm going to ask if you'll tee this up for us. Tell us kind of what the question is and flesh out a little bit for us what that looks like.
It's a really easy one.
Okay.
Does God exist?
Oh, yeah,
You know,
super easy. We're not
People
going
have
to even fill
talked
the
about
rest
it
of the
for a
time.
bit. It goes back a little ways.
Spoiler, he does.
So, yeah, it's a huge question, obviously.
The question is, does God exist?
Does God exist?
Okay.
And that, we're not talking about the Christian God
Right.
specifically. We're talking about any kind of theistic or even deistic God at this point.
Okay.
And what we do in apologetics is try to make a cumulative case that, if all of these arguments are sound, then we're establishing different characteristics along the way, right? So, for instance, there's about 24 or so
Hey,
arguments.
that's the title of a book you can go get on Amazon
Dr. Jerry Walls.
and others, Phil Talon, and yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the three easiest to kind of internalize, if you really want something to put in your back pocket,
Yeah.
are the cosmological
Whoa, I'm going to
argument.
stop you right there.
Okay.
Because I think the people that are listening, some of them, want to know this in very approachable terms. So I'm going to force you guys to use terms that aren't like cosmological and teleological.
Okay,
So
so-
give it to us in like very lay, cool, like everyman Joe kind of terms.
Yeah, so what the argument attempts to show is that anything that begins to exist has a cause.
Yeah.
And we know from our scientific observations that the universe did in fact have a beginning, a
Yeah.
finite time ago,
Yeah.
right? And therefore, the universe does have a cause. Now, if we just think about what that cause would have to be, if it caused the universe, it is not itself time, space, or matter,
Yeah.
because the universe is all time, space, and matter. Now, those three characteristics, what do you think of when you think of a uncaused first cause that is timeless, spaceless, and
A
immaterial?
genie or an
Obviously.
alien.
Yeah.
No, I
Robin
think of
Williams and his little.
Yeah.
No.
God.
But yeah, and then so it kind of builds on itself, like I said, in making a cumulative case. Now we have this uncaused first cause. Now what else can we deduce?
Okay, let me stop you for a second there. For those people listening that think, oh, he just went into philosophical terms, I think one of the simplest ways, I've heard John Hopper speak to this, he works for Search Ministries, is just to say to somebody, how did we get here?
Yeah. Like the origin of the universe.
The origin of the universe.
Origin,
yeah.
how did the universe get here?
Why is it here at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you don't, for those of you listening, you don't have to memorize these premises of the cosmological argument, though you can. They're actually not that hard to memorize. But you can just say, how did it all get here? Gosh, it seems like it started from, how did it start? It started from something, and whatever started it must have been outside of everything that we now know.
And just to build on that,
Yeah.
you can be comfortable here that you're making modest and well-founded claims. So if you ask, how did we get here, and they say, well, we don't really know, but
Yeah.
this, and this, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, but whatever the cause was, it wasn't itself the universe, right?
Right.
That is a modest claim, and I think, even without any philosophical training, you can be pretty comfortable having that conversation.
Yeah, everybody's heard of the Big Bang, so you start there. Okay. How'd that happen? Were you going to say something, Ted?
Oh yeah, just absolutely the origin of the universe, and that's one of the arguments that is often called to go into the big word, the cosmological. But you don't have to know the word cosmological. It just means where did the universe come from, the design of the universe, and the moral law. Those are the three basic arguments.
Okay, so just if we're listening, we're on question number 2, which is,
Does God
exist? And the sort of 3 evidences that you could give for that are what Taylor just talked about, where did the universe come from, and now you're going to tackle number 2, which
The
is
design of the universe.
design. Okay.
And here is I'll give the argument, and then I'll back away and give like a layman's explanation.
Okay.
And the premises are pretty straightforward in the design argument. Every design implies a designer. There is
Okay.
a design in the universe. Therefore, the universe must have had a designer. It's pretty basic. And there are, and we can come back to the origin of the universe in a minute. But as we're just throwing these out there, we can come back and have a discussion
Sure.
about the 3, because that's really kind of the remainder of today's podcast. And that is basically that there are 2 basic kinds of causes, and there are intelligent causes. And there are non-intelligent causes or natural causes. So in science or in these questions like the universe, there are actually two other questions. You could talk about the origin of the universe and the origin of life. Where did the first, beyond evolution,
Right.
beyond Darwin, where did the first life come from? Where did the very first life come from? And so with this idea about causes, science is really at the root of science. It's really about causality and what caused it. And so there are 2 basic kinds of causes. And imagine, I think everybody can imagine the picture of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, it's an amazing place. But that wasn't designed by Bill Gates.
Yeah.
But you can go to Mount Rushmore, and you can see that it's got the presidents carved on the side of the mountain. Well,
And that was designed by Bill Gates. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Cool.
No, it's not what I'm
I've
saying.
learned so much.
Exactly. The point I'm trying to make here is that anybody with just common sense can see that there's a difference between a natural cause and an intelligent cause. And as an archaeologist, that's one of the things that we do in archaeology. Archaeology is one of the forensic sciences in which we actually, if we go and we're digging in the dirt, and we can distinguish between a rock or a stone and an arrowhead, which we call a projectile point. And we know, and it has very minimal design, but we know that it does have design. But the design we're talking about in the universe is on the levels of complexity beyond anything humans can even comprehend today. For example, several years ago when I was teaching a class on apologetics, I saw an article in, I forgot what, it was one of those like Gizmodo or something like that,
Yeah.
or maybe it was Wired or something like
yeah.
that. And it was a guy who was just finishing his doctoral dissertation on, it was a PhD student and his professor, and they were trying to figure out what was the storage capacity for DNA. So they were trying to convert. They're researching like biomimetics, which is a whole branch of like learning from nature how to design engineering, like biomemory, like computer chips are in a phone. So they're trying to figure out, well, DNA can really store information a lot. Here's what they discovered: 1 gram of DNA. So that's basically in your pinky. So if you look at your pinky nail, the very end of your pinky is approximately 1 gram. Just take a guess, and Taylor can see my computer screen here, but Sarah, take a guess of, so like gigabytes and all that kind of thing.
I'm
So
going to fail this.
Just take a wild guess, like 1 gram of DNA, how much storage capacity, like converted that into like gigabytes or whatever you want?
47,000 gigabytes. Truth telling right now, I
Close.
don't know what a gigabyte is.
Close. What they discovered in this research is that 1 gram of DNA contains 700 terabytes.
I
of
was so
information.
close. Man, I was almost there.
That's 14, just so people can have some kind of like notion of how incredibly complex this information storage capacity is. That's 14,050 gigabyte Blu-ray disc in a single droplet of DNA that could fit on the tip of your little finger.
It's pretty cool.
Now that is incredible complexity on the level of we can't even duplicate that.
Yeah.
So that's design. I mean, that shows incredible complexity. And Stephen Meyer, who is a scientist out in Seattle, Washington, wrote a book called Signature in the Cell, in which he's actually addressing Richard Dawkins of it. Well, if we could find a signature, some kind of like a code or like a software program, and we actually do have. So there's incredible. So when you look at the biological world, and when you look at the world of science, and when you look at the world of even in astronomy, in
I was
cosmology,
literally just going to say you can drill down or you can
Or
look out.
you
And
can look
either
out.
way, yeah.
There's design everywhere. And you don't really have to get, folks, you don't have to know all this stuff. If people just know it intuitively.
Yeah.
You can see the complexity of a bird, like a bird can fly through the air, and you don't see, I mean, yes, birds do fly into windows, but
Sorry.
planes crash, but birds don't normally crash. They're pretty good, and fish do a good job swimming. they're designed that way. Animals are designed that way. So there's incredible design.
Let me pause you for a second just to remind our listeners you can call in anytime, 713-529-8737. Or again, we're on Facebook Live if you want to type out a question for either of these very smart gentlemen in the studio today. They will answer anything, you guys. Like if you have a recipe question, really anything. Once again, 713-529-8737. We would love to hear from you. And then we'll just take it back. So that's the second of the two topics that you can bring up to talk about if God exists is this idea of design. Hit me with, and then I have a devil's advocate question for you, but hit me with the third one, Taylor. What's the third kind of proof, quote, quote?
Yeah, the third proof is the existence of objective moral values. Now, when I say objective, all I mean by that is not based on human opinion, beyond human opinion.
Okay.
So what that would mean is, excuse me.
Some kind of morality outside ourselves.
That's right. Like, say you and I had a moral disagreement.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying is that there is a truth outside of us to which, we're both appealing, right? One of us is closer to that truth than the other.
Ted likes to say when we have these arguments that one of us is right, one of us is less right.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. It softens the blow. It's like saying you're wrong,
that is
but
right.
you're so pretty.
And that is right.
Okay, continue. Sorry.
No,
I am Mr. Right, by the way.
That's true. His last name is Wright, so he's always right. Womp womp.
Wonk, wonk. Go ahead, Taylor.
No, that's okay. I mean, so what the argument attempts to show is that if there is such a thing, is objective right and wrong beyond human opinion, then there must be a transcendent standard beyond human opinion that defines what right is.
Okay.
Okay, and again, just conceptual analysis of what that standard would have to be, and it gives you some more characteristics to add to this uncaused first cause that we talked about.
Okay, I have so many questions about this moral conversation because when this comes up, so little picture into Sarah's life. I run a group once a month called Conversations. If any of my Conversations people are listening, I miss you guys. They're great. It's almost all atheists and agnostics. We got a couple of Hindus in there. We have a couple of pagans in there. But none of them except for me and the co-host are on Team Jesus. And we have fascinating conversations. And I want to say that 9 out of 10 times, whatever we're talking about, we could be talking about artificial intelligence or politics or feminism or people's story. I mean, you name it. It always comes back to this idea of morality. Where does morality come from? Is it objective? Is it relative? And I struggle with how to say the right words to convince people that morality is objective. Help me with that.
I think you have one big advantage here.
Okay.
Almost everyone already believes it.
Ooh.
They just might not realize that they believe it. So
Okay.
our job is to help them realize that they believe it. And again, the way you can do this is to kind of press that view that morality is relative, if that's their view.
Yeah.
Press that to its logical conclusion. On what basis, then, are we going to condemn the criminals of the world?
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you because I want to hear this played out, and several other people might too. But so you say that there's an objective moral standard. I'm going to play the part of it's relative, and that the way that we have determined morality is because evolutionarily we've figured out over the billions of years what makes for human flourishing. And so as a society, we've decided, and some societies are a little more advanced than others, and we've decided certain things are poor form, right? They're not going to help us flourish and be happy and healthy and live on. So we're not going to cut in line, and we're not going to steal. We're not going to, like, murder is bad, but it's only bad because it keeps us from our human flourishing. What do you say to that?
So you put a lot out there. I'm going to go one
I
at a
know.
time.
Sorry.
Now, if we're really having a conversation, I just want to point out for the audience that I would start with a really simple question.
'Kay.
Right? Like, well, what's so good about human flourishing? Why is that good?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, because it makes me happy. Well, because it keeps us going, and there's some intrinsic need to continue life.
But what if I was to say that, human beings are robbing the planet of its natural resources, creating catastrophic climate change? I think the greatest good we could pursue would be self-extinction. Let's just stop having kids.
It's
The
got
human
dark real
race
fast,
continuing.
guys.
No, there's people that believe this,
Yeah.
though. And on this view that you're sharing with me that human flourishing can be some kind of shared moral standard that's objective,
Yeah.
why am I wrong?
You got me. Well, that was fast.
So, but when I say that people all believe that morality exists, that's a good example. One person, they believe that human flourishing is objectively good. Okay, well, what grounds that? Why is it objectively good? Because I think what you're doing there is appealing to a standard beyond yourself.
Well, I don't think they would say it is objectively good. They would just say it's the goal.
Right.
Okay. So,
Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just a minute. Whenever he's done.
Okay.
yeah, well, and so again, I would be tempted then to give them another scenario. Say Hitler wins World War II, and he
show
brainwashes
about
everybody into thinking.
Man in the High Castle.
There it is. He brainwashes everyone in the world into believing that killing Jews is objectively good. And let's say it's even good, we're just hypothesizing here. Let's say it's good for the flourishing of the German tribe, right? And so, based on this human flourishing example, then it actually is objectively good. Now, would that be true?
Yes, but no. I mean, yeah, you caught me again.
Okay.
So if you need someone that'll have a gotcha answer, Taylor is your go-to guy.
Let me add, Taylor, to what you were saying to sort of piggyback on, I think, what you were trying to get at earlier, and is this. And here's the question I would ask someone who really doesn't believe, or they press the point that, well, there really is no objective morality. It's just a matter of opinion. Okay, so here's the question I think most people know Adolf Hitler, and they know Mother Teresa of Calcutta.
Yeah.
Here's the question I would pose to that person. Is there an actual real difference between the actions of Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa? What's your answer? If they say, well, of course, obviously we know there's why? What's the difference? Well, because Hitler's bad. Well, why? What are you basing that? Based on what? Based on what? And it sort of piggybacks on what you're saying. Because why would Hitler's taking care of his people, the German people. He thought that he was, So if you believe that there is no such thing as objective morality, then essentially there really is no real difference between Mother Teresa and Hitler. What are you appealing to? Because that changes through time. I mean, and you can look at all kinds of dictators, not just Hitler. I mean, you can look into ancient history. There have been many people who have tyrants through history. And you can't say what they did was actually wrong. You can't. What are you appealing to? What standard are you appealing to? So, and to Sarah's point too, when you get into conversations with people about this, even though for us we believe that there is this objective moral standard that exists out there, but as far as having conversations, sometimes it's difficult to get people to, because we do. We live in such a culture in which we don't want to be looked at as being judgmental. Well, you can't judge this person. Look, that's the way they choose to live. Well, it's not a matter of, we're talking about the question of morality, and is there such a thing as absolute morality? And of course, Lewis in Mere Christianity.
And what's so wrong with judging anyway?
Exactly.
Yeah,
I know,
that's what I was going to say, actually.
And one thing I think you did there too is you also took care of that evolution objection in a roundabout sort of way, which I know somebody out there is screaming, well, what about evolution?
Yeah.
Well, like you said before, if we discover things through a process of evolution, that doesn't mean that those things weren't already existent, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, we don't create them; we discover them. Same
That's
as
right.
the laws of logic.
Exactly. They're there. And also, just for the Christians listening out there as well, I know we have probably a mixed crowd of people listening, maybe unbelievers and skeptics and people searching. But for the believers out there, let me say this. This is actually what Taylor and I and
Sarah. Yes.
I was thinking, because we were with Melissa.
Sure. We'll talk about that later.
Romans chapter 2 talks about the Apostle Paul talks about the moral law, and he says he's talking to the church at Rome, which was composed of Jews and Gentiles. And in chapter 1, he talks about his existence is known from creation. And the second thing he points to is the conscience. He says the Romans who don't have the law, they don't have the Ten Commandments, they don't have don't murder, don't kill. He says, but yet they have the law written on their hearts. Their conscience bearing witness. And the English word conscience, when you break it down, science, with knowledge.
That's the only way I can spell it.
With knowledge.
Oh yeah, that's
I told Sarah the story I think yesterday I told you the story. There's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Jay Budziszewski, and I'll tell this story as quick as I can. He was giving a lecture. This was a course he was giving on constitutional law. And so this is years ago when the question of partial birth abortion was coming up before the Supreme Court. And in this lecture, the lecture wasn't to discuss the morality of the question.
Yeah.
It was about the legality of it before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so as Dr. Budziszewski's giving the lecture, he's just merely describing what the process is of what a partial birth abortion is. And in the middle of the lecture, this girl got up in class, began screaming him obscenities and cursing, and she got up and stormed out. He had no idea, but found out later the girl had multiple abortions. And the point is that why did she have this guilt for killing her children? Where did that come from? Where he wasn't preaching against it.
Why do we all seem to justify our actions with reasons if there is no standard that we feel accountable to?
Exactly. He's written several books. Written on the Heart is one. Revenge of the Conscience, in which Budziszewski talks about the moral law written in the heart. And this goes back to a long tradition in Christian thought, going back to Aquinas, Augustine, C.S. Lewis talked about this. So there are a lot of great Christian thinkers who go back to this notion of the moral law. Alistair McIntyre, I'm not sure if he was a believer, but after virtue. So this is a very important argument, I think, for God's existence. And we've talked about three.
And of course, Dostoevsky realized this.
Absolutely.
He said, if God is not, then all things are
permissible. That's right. Exactly right.
Sounds like you're saying, oh, go ahead.
Well, I want to make one point, and I think you actually made this point too, but I just wanted to make it really simple. One thing that we're not saying is that atheists can't be good people, and we're emphatically saying the opposite.
That's exactly right.
It's written on all of our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Whether you believe it or not.
That's exactly right. In fact, that's to your point, Taylor. I actually, on my personal blog, about a couple of years ago, I wrote an article called Honest Atheism, and I was trying to press the point. I was basically creating an argument ad absurdum, taking the logical, to its logical conclusion. If there's no God, then it doesn't matter what you can just do whatever you want to do. Don't talk about morality. Just go ride your bike or go to the beach, whatever. Don't.
Sacrificing for others would be the dumbest thing you could do.
Yeah, it would.
Absolutely. So, but one of the things that one of the atheists said in the response in the blog comments was that, are you saying we can't be good? No, absolutely. In fact, I said in the blog comments to one of my atheist friends that I was dialoguing with that, no, I actually know a lot of atheists that actually live sometimes more moral lives than some believers I know.
That'll preach.
So, So there are good atheists out there who love their families, who love their kids, they take care of their family, but that's not the argument, though.
Yeah, so this is funny. I had the same experience on my blog. I talked about the moral argument. Somebody came in, just like you said, so you're saying that I can't be a good person. I do all these things, and, you're calling me a bad person. I'm like, no. You misunderstand me. I'm saying emphatically that you can be a good person, but only if God exists.
Hey! No one's going to want to hang out with Taylor after all these. It sounds like you're saying when we talk about morality that there's this idea outside of us, which is this standard that we can kind of point to, but there's also something inside of us, which is our conscience, that all of us have whether we like it or not, and we can point to either of those, which is helpful for me. So we've talked about two questions, but within the second question, which is, does God exist, we've got this idea of where did it all start, the design, and then, of course, this idea of morality. And I want to go backwards for a second because I want to play devil's advocate about the first of those sub-arguments. When you start talking about the origins of the universe, I think most of my skeptical friends would say, okay, we can assent to the fact that there was this Big Bang thing. Everyone's kind of on the same page about that. What happened, quote, before the Big Bang, and I'm using quotes because then you get into all this time. There was no time. You can't use words about time, but we're limited in our, linguistics, so we're going to use that word. Before the Big Bang, what was happening? And they would come back and say, we just don't know. It doesn't mean that we won't ever know. We don't know. And so you Christians, what you're doing is by inserting God into that space, you're falling into that classical God of the gaps fallacy, which, of course, just for anybody listening who doesn't know, is this idea that Christians throughout the years, when they, or really any religion, when they don't understand something scientifically, they just say, well, it must have been God. So it might, whether it was lightning and that was Zeus or whatever, if we don't understand something, we say, oh, that's just God, which I think has happened. And then as science answers more questions, there's less and less of a need for God. Now, I would argue, and if you really want to hear somebody speak more intelligently to this, there was a podcast with Melissa Cain Travis right here on Theology on Air where she addressed this, and you can go back and listen to that. It's great. I would say that the more we discover scientifically, the more it points to God. But still with this cosmological argument, I think somebody could say that. What do you say in response when they say, well, we don't know what
Yeah.
happened before the Big Bang, but you're just
So-
claiming God? That's not fair.
Yeah, and you're right. This does come up all the time, and I really want to drive home that this is just a really bad misunderstanding of the cosmological argument. Sorry for using that word.
I used it, so now you can use
Yeah,
it. It's like
yeah,
win,
I
lose, or
get
draw.
permission now.
Okay.
But it really does misunderstand it because the argument doesn't say we can't explain it, therefore God. It doesn't say
okay.
that. This is a deduction. Okay, and all
Okay.
that means is if the premises of the argument are true, then the conclusion follows necessarily.
'Kay.
Right. So an example of this would be like, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right? Now, if those premises are true, then that conclusion is necessary. And so this is the same thing that we're doing with the universe. We're saying that anything that begins to exist has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. And like I said before, the universe, rightly understood, is all time, space, matter.
Yeah.
So that means necessarily the cause of the universe is timeless, spaceless, and material.
Yeah.
That's it.
And he puts his hands up like,
Yeah.
please don't shoot me.
Yeah.
But in some of to the skeptics' point, and what they would say, and I've actually been reading up on this lately about inflation theory, is they're trying to get people who sort of go over to the inflation theory are trying to get out of this cosmic beginning. In
Yes.
fact, even when the Big Bang, in fact, that term was coined by Fred Hoyle, who was a cosmologist, kind of making a joke about a derogatory Big Bang. But all of the models, I mean, there are people trying to get around this idea, well, there's a multiverse, or maybe there was a quantum fluctuation or whatever. But here's what I think. This is just a value judgment on this. Here's the thing, folks. Just because a scientist says it doesn't make it true.
Yeah.
Scientists have biases just like anybody else. Just because he has a white lab coat on or because they look through a telescope, that doesn't mean that they're right. Nonsense is nonsense no matter what. That's exactly right. So what I
What's
want
the
to say
phrase you like to say? Science doesn't tell
say
us
anything.
Scientists
do. That's right. So all I was going to say is that they're trying to get out of this idea of a beginning because they don't like the metaphysical implications of this. But even if we didn't use that argument, and we are right now, just to clarify, we are talking about a specific argument called the Kalam argument, which is supported by, at least it's reinforced by Big Bang cosmology. But let me just say, again, I'm going to get nerdy here for a second, but there's a completely
Oh, you've been
different-
nerdy from the beginning. It's cool. It's cool.
Well, in light
Stay
of what we're talking
nerdy.
about. Yes. But in light
Indiana
of-
Jones was nerdy too.
That's
I
true.
know,
He
and all the
was.
Or a
girls
bow
loved
tie.
him.
Come on.
He did. I've got bow ties. So,
I know you do.
but anyway, what I was going to say is that my point was
That was so important because you were going to go to the really some of the best arguments for the beginning of the universe have been around long before contemporary science, and
Exactly.
that's exactly where you.
Aquinas. Yeah, Aquinas is vertical. So it's an issue with causality and motion. And Ed Fazer, who is a professor of philosophy out in California, has a book called Five Proofs of the Existence of God. And none of these arguments, they're all based on Aristotle, Aquinas, and great thinkers, Augustine, Leibniz. None of these have anything to do, I mean, they're very strong arguments, but they are not dependent upon current scientific theories. But even if there was some new theory that came out that, well, maybe there was something before, you still have the universe is a contingent thing, and so contingent things can't cause themselves. You can't.
That's right.
If you got nothing, if you have a hat of nothing, that's all you'll ever have. So you've got to have a cause. So the issue is, again, this is not a Christian criticism. This is a causality thing. So
Taylor's chomping at the bit.
Go
What do we got?
No, I think you covered it actually adequately. I think you covered it really well.
Thank
I was
you.
going to say something and you got it.
thank you, sir.
I wanna say something here at the end, and we're getting close to the close, but and we will talk about this also in part 2 of this podcast. But all of the stuff that we're talking about, to even get into this conversation with someone is a little bit of a trick sometimes. It's tricky, and so I just wanted to also get y'all's opinions on this, because when I'm talking to somebody, I can't start with, hey, what'd you get in your, what kind of coffee did you get? Do
believe
you
in
think the
God?
universe had a cause? Yeah. So, for me, I have found that there has to be some sort of relational pre-gaming that happens before you do this.
What
Oh.
I do is when I go to Starbucks and I get a latte,
Oh,
and,
boy.
and I look at the milk and I say,
No,
you know,
stop.
that
No.
milk looks like a
No.
it looks like a spiral galaxy, and that reminds me
We
of
do not recommend this form of apologetics.
Just kidding.
You're thirsty? Let me tell you about living water. No.
You know, my answer is kind
Oh,
of
gosh.
embarrassing now. But legitimately, like, no, I do look for, like, if they're wearing any kind of religious paraphernalia at all.
That's a little
You know?
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I like your cross. Tell me
Yeah.
about that. Or, does that pendant have religious significance? That's a,
Yeah.
a scenario from Greg Koukl.
Well,
Um,
one thing that I found engaging with atheists, agnostics, skeptics, is just, obviously having a friendship with somebody lets you know where things are working, where things aren't working. And so it's only a matter of time until somebody starts talking about something that's stressful, ideas around purpose and meaning, especially in this time of coronavirus. People are scared or nervous. And I think it's a great lead in to just say, listen, I get it, man, that is stressful. When I get stressed, and this is just for me, because, I'm one of those Team Jesus freaks, like I pray or I think about what God might have to say about this. And that might sound crazy to you, but I don't know. Do you think there might be a God? And just throw it out there. I think there are things
great.
like that everybody can do around the water cooler, as it were, in quotes. I realize not everybody has a water cooler anymore, but the proverbial water cooler. Those conversations can begin.
Tend to just happen.
Yeah.
No less than 70% of my conversations beyond 2 minutes become spiritual.
Mhm.
And it's not because I'm forcing the issue. Those things just start to happen.
Well, I will say this then, and I think this is a great segue. The reason why that happens for you, Taylor Neill, and Ted, and myself, and others, is because we have it on the front of our minds because it is so important. And we know that if it's true that God is real, and if, episode 2, we're going to talk about Jesus, if all the stuff the Bible says that happened with Jesus really did happen, then that means there is just great hope, joy, abiding peace, even in the time of coronavirus. All those things are true. And if all those things are true, we are eager to talk to people about it. And so it's on the forefront of your mind. I don't think it's on the forefront of everybody's minds. And so I'm hoping that this podcast and the next one can inspire people that you don't have to be as smart as these guys here in the studio to be able to just open up like, gosh, it seems to me like there must be a God because I have this thing like a conscience, or the universe just seems to have such a beautiful design. I don't know how that could happen with it. You can say it in normal people terms, but
Sure.
We've got just a couple minutes left. How about any final thoughts on these first 2 questions? And then you'll have to come back to the second podcast to hear the
Yes.
rest.
I have one quick thing. I want to go back to the design of the universe and something that I think everybody can take with them. There's a new science I came across several years ago, and it was actually a TED Talk. Not me.
Hey,
but,
TED Talk.
It's a TED Talk by a biologist named Janine Benyus, or Benyet, whatever her name is. Anyway, she
Benyus.
wrote a book called The Science of Biomimicry, and essentially what it is engineers are looking to nature to solve engineering problems. And this whole science of biomimicry, like gecko feet, how to make little robots that climb up windows, things like that. Biomimetics is a whole amazing thing. And this whole thing about, well, here's the thing is that naturalists and people who don't believe in God say, well, the universe looks designed, but it wasn't. But wait a minute, you're looking for nature to try to find optimal design. And
Yeah.
you're saying it's not designed. So what is it designed or is it not? And in fact, they're looking to nature to optimize their design that they can't even do. One of the best
Interesting.
examples was a story I came across. I was in the Air Force years ago, and one of my favorite airplanes is a SR-71 Blackbird, and the
Same.
Yes, it's the fastest plane in the world. Anyway, the engineer who was trying to break the sound. Well, they did break the sound barrier, but they were trying to make it go really fast. And he was watching a documentary on a peregrine falcon, the fastest animal in the world, and found out it has nose cones to help it breathe in a dive. So when they began to modulate the cones in the jet engine of the SR-71, it began to have more and break more speed records.
Oh, interesting.
And he used this nature, a falcon, to help create the most advanced jet airplane in the
Wow.
world.
Yeah.
Another evidence of design.
That's right.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Well, Taylor, I'm going to give you the last word on the next podcast, but unless do you have something very quick to say?
No, go.
Okay. But just if people are listening and they want to find you guys and they want to learn more about your thoughts on things or dialogue with you, where can we find Taylor? Where can we find you?
I have a blog, neillology.com, neillology.com. I'm going to be releasing new content weekly. That's going to start in the next couple of months.
And Ted?
And they can find me at epicarchaeology.org, and also follow us on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel and Instagram and, of course, Facebook page, Epic Archaeology.
Just Google it. You'll find it.
Epicarchaeology.org.
And or you could just Google modern day Indiana Jones. If we get enough hits, we can make him come up first on the Google search. But yes, and of course, check us out, Theology on Air, by checking out facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston. That's sort of the mother of this ministry. And or you can look on Twitter at HoustonTOT, #HoustonTOT, #Theology on Air. Thanks for joining us, and we will find you again to finish this conversation. But until we do, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.